The gunshot that changed Lydia Keller's life echoed through Redemption Springs like thunder on a cloudless day. The bullet wasn't meant for her, but for the man who'd promised her the world and delivered nothing but heartache. Now she stood accused of a crime she didn't commit, and the entire town had already declared her guilty. Redemption Springs, Colorado Territory, 1875, was a place that lived up to only half its name. The Springs part was accurate enough, crystal clear water bubbling up from deep within the earth, giving life to an otherwise unforgiving landscape. But redemption, that was harder to come by, especially for a woman like Lydia. The dusty main street stretched before her as she made her way toward the courthouse. Her once fine blue dress now faded and stained with the remnants of 3 days in the sheriff's cramped jail cell. Her auburn hair, usually pinned neatly beneath her bonnet, hung in loose strands around her face. The whispers followed her like snakes in tall grass. "Jezebel," one woman hissed as Lydia passed. "Murderess," said another. Sheriff Tanner gripped her arm tightly as he escorted her, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. They had known each other for years, but now he treated her like a stranger. "Keep walking, Miss Keller," he muttered. "Courthouse is just ahead." The town square was unusually crowded for a Tuesday morning. It seemed everyone in Redemption Springs had come out to witness her humiliation. Men who had once tipped their hats to her now stared with open disdain. Women who had shared tea with her clutched their children closer, as if her mere presence might corrupt their innocent souls. She kept her eyes fixed on the dusty ground, each step an effort as the weight of their judgment pressed down upon her shoulders. She had never felt so alone, so utterly abandoned, until she heard the spurs. The gentle, rhythmic jingling cut through the murmurs of the crowd. Heavy boots fell into step beside her, and she felt rather than saw someone fall into stride with her and Sheriff Tanner. "That's far enough, Foster," the sheriff said, his voice tight. "I'm just walking to the courthouse, same as you," came the reply, the voice deep and steady as a heartbeat. Lydia lifted her gaze to find Foster Sullivan walking beside her, his tall frame casting a shadow that seemed to shield her from the crowd's scrutiny. His dark Stetson was pulled low over blue eyes that surveyed the onlookers with quiet defiance. Unlike the others, he showed no shame in being seen with her. "She's my prisoner," Sheriff Tanner insisted. "And she's innocent until proven guilty," Foster replied simply. "Or have we abandoned that principle along with common decency?" The crowd's whispers intensified. Foster Sullivan was a man who commanded respect in Redemption Springs. He ran the largest cattle operation in the county, employed half the men in town, and was known for his fairness and integrity. He was also known for his stubborn streak. Once he took a position, nothing short of God himself could move him from it. And now, inexplicably, he had taken a position beside Lydia Keller. She walked with shame across the square. The cowboy walked beside her proud. His presence didn't erase the stares or silence the whispers, but somehow it made them easier to bear. "Thank you," she whispered, so softly she wasn't sure he heard. But he had. His only response was a slight nod as they continued toward the courthouse where her fate would be decided. The courthouse was a sturdy stone building that stood in stark contrast to the wooden structures surrounding it. It had been built to last, just like the law it represented, unyielding and indifferent to the pleas of those who found themselves on the wrong side of it. As they climbed the steps, Foster's hand brushed against hers, perhaps by accident, perhaps not. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her, a reminder that human touch didn't always have to hurt. Inside, the courtroom was already packed. Judge Monroe sat behind his imposing desk, his silver mustache neatly trimmed, his eyes cold as he watched Lydia enter. The prosecutor, a thin man named Hobson with ambitions that far exceeded his talents, arranged his papers with theatrical importance. Sheriff Tanner led Lydia to her place at the defendant's table, but before he could step away, Foster spoke up. "I'll be sitting with Miss Keller." Judge Monroe's bushy eyebrows rose. "Are you representing the accused, Mr. Sullivan?" "No, Your Honor, but every defendant deserves someone on their side, and it appears Miss Keller has no one else." The judge frowned, but nodded his permission. The spectators murmured in surprise. Lydia herself couldn't quite believe it. She had exchanged pleasantries with Foster Sullivan perhaps a dozen times in the 3 years she'd lived in Redemption Springs, but they were hardly more than acquaintances. "You don't have to do this," she whispered as he took the seat beside her. "I know." His expression remained unreadable. "But someone should." Judge Monroe banged his gavel, bringing the room to order. "The territory of Colorado versus Lydia Keller. The charge is murder in the first degree of Mr. Zachary Parrish. How does the defendant plead?" Lydia rose on unsteady legs. "Not guilty, Your Honor." The trial proceeded with brutal efficiency. Prosecutor Hobson painted her as a woman of loose morals who had seduced Zachary Parrish, a married man and the town's most prominent banker. According to his version of events, when Parrish had tried to end their alleged affair, she had shot him in a jealous rage. "The evidence is clear," Hobson declared, gesturing to the blood-stained handkerchief found at the scene with Lydia's initials embroidered in the corner. "Miss Keller's presence at Mr. Parrish's office that evening is undisputed. Her handkerchief was found beside the body. The murder weapon was recovered from the alley behind her millinery shop." With each damning detail, Lydia felt her chances of acquittal slipping away. The truth that she had gone to confront Parrish about the money he had embezzled from her small savings account, that he had attacked her when she threatened to expose him, that someone else must have shot him after she fled, seemed increasingly implausible even to her own ears. When it came time for her to testify, she told her story as clearly and honestly as she could. She explained how she had arrived in Redemption Springs 3 years earlier, how she had worked tirelessly to establish her millinery shop, how she had trusted Parrish with her modest savings. "He was supposed to be helping my business grow," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "But when I checked the balance last week, nearly everything was gone. When I confronted him, he laughed, said no one would believe me over him." "And that made you angry," Hobson suggested. "Yes, it made me angry. He stole from me. But I didn't kill him. I couldn't have killed him." "Yet your handkerchief was found at the scene. The murder weapon was found near your shop." "I dropped my handkerchief when I fled his office. As for the gun, I've never owned one, never even fired one." The prosecutor smiled thinly. "A convenient claim, but one that cannot be proven." When she returned to her seat, Foster leaned closer. "You're doing fine," he whispered. "Just keep telling the truth." By late afternoon, the prosecution had rested its case. With no attorney to present a defense, Judge Monroe asked if anyone would speak on Lydia's behalf. The courtroom fell silent. Then Foster Sullivan stood. "Your Honor, I'd like to address the court." Judge Monroe appeared surprised but nodded his assent. "Proceed, Mr. Sullivan." Foster moved to the front of the courtroom with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. He turned to face the spectators, his gaze sweeping over the familiar faces. "I've known most of you for years," he began. "We've broken bread together, celebrated births, mourned deaths. We've helped each other through droughts and blizzards. We've built something here in Redemption Springs, not just a town, but a community." He paused, letting his words settle. "And yet today, I see that community ready to condemn a woman based on circumstantial evidence and malicious gossip. I see good people willing to believe the worst about someone who has lived among us honorably for 3 years, who has never given anyone cause to doubt her character." Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "I don't know if Lydia Keller killed Zachary Parrish, neither do any of you, but I do know this: Zach Parrish was not the upstanding citizen he pretended to be. Many of us entrusted him with our money, and many of us have noticed discrepancies in our accounts." A murmur ran through the crowd. Foster had struck a nerve. "I myself discovered last month that several $100s had mysteriously disappeared from my cattle business account. When I confronted Parrish, he blamed clerical errors and promised to investigate. I suspect Miss Keller had a similar experience, only she had far more to lose." The prosecutor jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, this is mere speculation and has no bearing on the facts of the case." "On the contrary," Foster replied before the judge could respond. It establishes a pattern of behavior that supports Miss Keller's testimony. It also suggests that Parrish had made enemies beyond Miss Keller, any of whom might have had motive to kill him. Judge Monroe stroked his mustache thoughtfully. Continue, Mr. Sullivan, but confine yourself to relevant matters. Foster nodded. The prosecution has made much of the handkerchief found at the scene. Miss Keller has admitted it was hers and that she was at Parrish's office that evening. She doesn't deny these facts, but that handkerchief proves only her presence, not her guilt. He turned to the jury, 12 men who had been watching with increasing interest. As for the gun found near her shop, consider this. If you had just committed murder, would you discard the weapon so close to your own property, or would you ensure it was never found? It was a compelling point, and Lydia saw several jurors nod slightly. Finally, Foster said, his voice softening, I ask you to consider who Lydia Keller is, not the woman of Hobson's lurid imagination, but the actual person who has lived among us. A woman who works hard, who creates beautiful things with her hands, who has never sought charity despite the challenges of establishing a business on her own. A woman who greets each of you with a smile when you enter her shop, who remembers your wife's preferences and your daughter's favorite colors. He turned to look directly at Lydia, and the intensity in his blue eyes made her breath catch. That is the woman on trial today. Not a murderess, not a Jezebel, but a neighbor who deserves the same justice any of us would expect. The evidence against her is circumstantial at best. To condemn her would be a grave injustice, one that would haunt this community long after today's verdict is forgotten. With that, he returned to his seat beside Lydia. Under the table, she reached for his hand and squeezed it briefly, unable to find words to express her gratitude. Judge Monroe instructed the jury on the law, emphasizing that they must be convinced of Lydia's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Then, the 12 men filed out to deliberate. The waiting was excruciating. Lydia and Foster remained at the defendant's table while the spectators gradually dispersed to await the verdict. Sheriff Tanner stood guard, his expression unreadable. "Why did you do that?" Lydia finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You barely know me." Foster was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on some distant point. "My mother was accused of something she didn't do back in Texas," he finally said. "No one stood up for her. No one questioned the evidence or spoke to her character. She died in prison for a crime she never committed." He looked at her then, his eyes reflecting old pain. "I promised myself I'd never stand by and watch that happen to anyone else." "I'm sorry about your mother," Lydia said softly. "It was a long time ago." He straightened in his chair. "But maybe that's why I've always noticed you, Miss Keller. There's a dignity about you even now, especially now." The jury deliberated for nearly 3 hours. When they finally returned, the courtroom quickly filled again. Lydia's heart pounded so hard she feared it might burst from her chest. Foster's steady presence beside her was the only thing keeping her from complete panic. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Monroe asked. The foreman, a grizzled storekeeper named Daniels, stood. "We have, Your Honor. What say you?" "We find the defendant, Lydia Keller, not guilty." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom, followed by a buzz of conversation. Relief flooded through Lydia so intensely that for a moment she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. It was only when Foster gently touched her elbow that she realized she was free. Judge Monroe banged his gavel. "Order! The defendant is acquitted and free to go. This court is adjourned." As the crowd began to disperse, some looking disappointed, others thoughtful, Sheriff Tanner approached them. "Miss Keller, I'll have your personal effects ready for you to collect at the jail." "Thank you, Sheriff," she replied, finding her voice at last. He hesitated, then added gruffly, "For what it's worth, I'm glad you were acquitted. Something about this case never sat right with me." As he walked away, Lydia turned to Foster. "I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks necessary." He offered his arm. "May I escort you home?" She placed her hand in the crook of his elbow. suddenly aware of how ragged she must look after days in jail and the emotional trial. "I must be a frightful sight." "You look like a woman who's been through hell and survived it," he replied simply. "There's nothing frightful about that." They walked out of the courthouse together. The bright afternoon sun made Lydia blink after the dimness inside. The town square was busy with people going about their daily business, many of whom paused to stare at the newly acquitted woman and the respected rancher at her side. She felt a moment of panic at facing all those judging eyes again. Perhaps I should go alone. Foster's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm. "They'll talk no matter what you do. Might as well give them something worth talking about." And so, she walked with shame across the square. The cowboy walked beside her proud. With each step, she felt a fraction of her strength return. By the time they reached the sheriff's office to collect her belongings, she was holding her head a little higher. Sheriff Tanner handed over the small bundle that contained everything she'd had with her when she was arrested: her reticule with its meager contents, her bonnet, and the shawl she'd been wearing against the evening chill. "Miss Keller," the sheriff said as she turned to leave, "there's something else you should know. We're still investigating Parrish's murder. New evidence has come to light." She turned back, suddenly alert. "What evidence?" "Mrs. Parrish confessed this morning that her husband had been systematically stealing from his clients for years. She claims she didn't know about his death until the next morning, but several witnesses saw her near the bank around the time of the murder." "Victoria Parrish?" Lydia couldn't hide her surprise. The banker's wife was a quiet, seemingly timid woman who rarely participated in town social events. "Why would she kill him?" "Apparently he was planning to leave her for another woman," Tanner replied, "and she'd recently discovered he'd been transferring their assets to an account in his name only. So he was planning to abandon her penniless," Foster mused. "That's a powerful motive." "Indeed it is," Tanner agreed. "We're continuing the investigation. If Mrs. Parrish is charged, you may be called to testify about what happened in his office that night." Lydia nodded. "Of course. I'll help however I can." Outside again, Foster walked her the short distance to her millinery shop and modest apartment above it. The "closed" sign hung in the window where it had been since her arrest. Lydia felt a surge of anxiety as she unlocked the door. Would her business survive this scandal, acquittal, or not? As if reading her thoughts, Foster said, "People have short memories when it suits them. By next month, this will all be forgotten." "I hope you're right." She pushed open the door, a small bell announcing their entry. The familiar scents of fabric, straw, and ribbons welcomed her home. "Would you like to come in for tea? It's the least I can offer after everything you've done." He hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you. I would." The shop was exactly as she'd left it: hats on stands, bolts of ribbon neatly arranged by color, sewing implements organized on her work table. She led Foster through to the small kitchen at the back, grateful that she had at least left it tidy before her fateful visit to the bank that night. "Please sit down," she said, gesturing to the small table. "I'll put the kettle on." As she moved about the kitchen, filling the kettle and setting it on the stove, she was acutely aware of his presence. Foster Sullivan filled the small space with his quiet strength, making it seem both smaller and safer simultaneously. "I've been meaning to ask," she said as she laid out cups and saucers. "How did you know about the discrepancies in people's accounts? Had others complained besides yourself?" "A few," he confirmed. "Mostly smaller amounts that could be explained away as errors. But after our conversation at the general store last month, you mentioned you were finally seeing a return on your savings. I started asking around. Several people reported similar issues." Lydia paused in her preparation. "You were investigating Parrish even before his murder?" "Not investigating exactly, just being cautious. Something about him never sat right with me." The kettle whistled, and Lydia prepared the tea, her mind racing. If Victoria Parrish is convicted of his murder, what happens to the bank, to everyone's money? "That's a good question." Foster accepted the cup she offered. "The territorial bank examiner is coming next week to review the accounts. With luck, Some of the stolen funds can be recovered." They sipped their tea in companionable silence for a few minutes. Lydia found herself studying Foster, the strong lines of his face, the small scar above his right eyebrow, the way his capable hands dwarfed the delicate teacup. She had always thought him handsome in a rugged way, but had never allowed herself to dwell on it. He was Foster Sullivan, after all, the most eligible bachelor in the county, and she was just the milliner who had arrived in town with nothing but a small trunk of possessions and a determination to make a new life. "Why did you really help me today?" she asked suddenly. "The truth, please. It wasn't just about your mother." His blue eyes met hers directly. "No, it wasn't just that, though that was part of it." He set down his cup carefully. "I've watched you since you came to Redemption Springs, Miss Keller. I've admired your determination, your independence. When I heard you'd been arrested, I knew immediately that something was wrong. You couldn't have known I was innocent." "I suppose not," he acknowledged, "but I knew you weren't the woman they were describing, and I couldn't stand by and watch you face their judgment alone." A lump formed in her throat. "Well, I'm grateful, more than I can say. But you should know that your association with me may cost you. People will talk." He smiled then, a rare sight that transformed his serious face. "Let them. I've never much cared what people think of me, Miss Keller, and neither should you. Please call me Lydia." Lydia. He said her name as if tasting it, and something warm unfurled in her chest at the sound. "Then you must call me Foster." "Foster?" She smiled back at him, feeling oddly shy. "Will you tell me about your ranch? I've heard it's quite impressive." He described the Double S Ranch with obvious pride, 5,000 acres of the best grazing land in the county, a herd of nearly 1,000 cattle, a dozen loyal ranch hands, and a house he had built himself when he first arrived 10 years earlier. "It's not fancy," he said, "but it's solid. 3 bedrooms, a good kitchen, a study where I keep the books, and a wide porch that wraps around 2 sides, perfect for watching the sunset over the mountains." "It sounds lovely," Lydia said sincerely. She had always found solace in beautiful surroundings, which was part of why she had chosen millinery as her trade. Creating beautiful hats from simple materials gave her a sense of order and purpose in a chaotic world. "You should see it sometime," he said, then seemed surprised by his own words. "That is, if you'd care to, when things have settled down." Was Foster Sullivan inviting her to his ranch? The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. "I'd like that," she replied, trying to sound casual despite the butterflies suddenly taking flight in her stomach. They talked for nearly an hour, the conversation flowing easily between them. Lydia found herself telling him things she had never shared with anyone in Redemption Springs about growing up in Philadelphia, about losing both parents to influenza when she was 19, about her decision to travel west after their deaths. "I had no family left," she explained, "and I couldn't bear to stay in a city filled with memories, so I took what money I had, bought a train ticket, and kept going until I found a place that felt right." "And that was Redemption Springs?" She smiled wistfully. "It was. The moment I stepped off the stagecoach, something about the mountains, the clear air, it felt like I could breathe again. I knew I'd found home." "I felt the same way when I came here from Texas," he admitted, "though I was running from different ghosts." His mother's unjust conviction, she assumed, but there was something in his tone that suggested more to the story. She didn't press him, though. They had time for such confidences now. Eventually, Foster rose to leave. "You need rest," he said, noting the fatigue that was surely evident on her face. "And I have ranch business to attend to." At the door, he took her hand. His palm was warm and rough against hers, the hand of a man who worked alongside his ranch hands despite his prosperity. "May I call on you tomorrow? Perhaps we could have dinner at the hotel restaurant." The invitation took her by surprise. "Are you sure? People will certainly talk then." "Let them," he said again, his expression resolute. "Unless you'd rather not be seen with me." "No, that is, I would be honored. I just don't want to cause you any trouble." His smile returned, warming his eyes. "Trouble finds me whether I look for it or not, Lydia Keller. But this is the kind I'd welcome." After he left, Lydia moved around her shop, touching familiar objects, reacquainting herself with the life she had nearly lost. She felt strange lighter somehow, as if a burden she hadn't fully recognized had been lifted from her shoulders. That night, she slept deeply for the first time in days, and if her dreams were filled with a certain blue-eyed cowboy, there was no one to know but her. The next morning, Lydia rose early and set about restoring order to her life. She cleaned her shop thoroughly, opened the windows to let in fresh air, and rearranged her display window to showcase her latest creations. At precisely 9 o'clock, she flipped the sign to "Open" and waited. For the first hour, no one came. She occupied herself with inventory, trying not to watch the clock or peer anxiously out the window. Just as she was beginning to fear that her business was ruined, the bell above the door jingled. Mrs. Peterson, the blacksmith's wife, entered cautiously. "Good morning. Miss Keller." "Good morning, Mrs. Peterson. How may I help you today?" The older woman hesitated, then squared her shoulders. "I need a new hat for church on Sunday. Something modest, but pretty. My Henry says I deserve something special for our anniversary." "Of course." Lydia's professional demeanor took over, and she led Mrs. Peterson to a selection of hats suitable for a married woman of her age and station. "Perhaps this navy straw with the silk ribbon? It would complement your blue dress beautifully." By noon, Lydia had served 3 customers, not her usual number for a morning, but enough to give her hope. Each woman had been slightly awkward at first, but the universal language of fashion and flattery had quickly overcome any lingering discomfort. She was just about to close for lunch when Victoria Parrish appeared in the doorway. The banker's widow was dressed in black, her face pale beneath her veil. She seemed to hesitate before entering, as if unsure of her welcome. "Mrs. Parrish," Lydia said, surprised, "please come in." Victoria glided into the shop, her movements tentative. She was a petite woman, fragile-looking, with delicate features and hands that fluttered like nervous birds. Today, those hands clutched a handkerchief tightly. "Miss Keller, I owe you an apology," she said without preamble, her voice barely above a whisper. "I should have spoken up sooner. I should have told them what I knew about Zachary." Lydia gestured to the small sitting area where customers tried on hats. "Please sit down." Victoria perched on the edge of a chair, her back straight as a knife blade. Sheriff Tanner told me you were acquitted. I'm glad." "Thank you." Lydia took the seat opposite her, uncertain what to say. This woman had potentially killed her husband, the same man who had attacked Lydia and stolen her savings. What was the appropriate etiquette for such a situation? "I didn't kill him," Victoria said suddenly, as if reading Lydia's thoughts. "I wanted to, God help me, when I found out about his stealing, about his other women. But I didn't." The sheriff mentioned new evidence. "Yes, I was near the bank that night. I followed Zachary there. I was going to confront him, demand that he return the money he'd taken from our joint accounts." She twisted the handkerchief in her lap. "But when I arrived, I saw you leaving. You were upset, stumbling almost. I hid in the shadows because I didn't want anyone to see me in such a state." Lydia leaned forward. "Did you see anyone else go into the bank after me?" Victoria nodded slowly. "A man. I couldn't see his face clearly. He wore a hat pulled low. But he was tall, well-dressed. He went in minutes after you left." "And you told the sheriff this?" "Yes, this morning. After I learned you'd been acquitted. I should have said something sooner, but I was afraid. Zachary had powerful friends." Lydia thought of the mysterious man. Who could it have been? Another victim of Parrish's embezzlement, perhaps, one who had confronted the banker and received a less fortunate outcome than Lydia's escape. "Mrs. Parrish, Victoria, I'm truly sorry for your loss, despite everything." The widow's smile was a fleeting, sad thing. "He wasn't always the man you met, Miss Keller. When we first married, he was kind, ambitious in an honest way. But money changed him. Power changed him. She stood abruptly. I should go. I just wanted you to know I never believed you killed him. What will you do now? Lydia asked, rising as well. Leave Redemption Springs, I think. There's nothing for me here but painful memories. Victoria moved toward the door, then paused. You're fortunate, you know, to have someone like Mr. Sullivan stand beside you. Not many would have done what he did. After Victoria left, Lydia found herself unable to concentrate on work. Her mind kept returning to their conversation, to the mystery of Zachary Parrish's murder, and to the unexpected support of Foster Sullivan. By the time she closed the shop at 5 o'clock, she was both mentally exhausted and nervously anticipating the evening ahead. She chose her nicest dress for dinner, a deep green silk that brought out the auburn highlights in her hair. It was perhaps more formal than the hotel restaurant warranted, but after days in a jail cell and the shabby blue dress of her trial, she craved the confidence that came with looking her best. Foster arrived precisely at 6, looking handsome in a dark suit that had been brushed free of the ranch dust. He carried a small bouquet of wildflowers. These grow near the creek on my property, he said, offering them to her. I thought they might brighten your window. They're beautiful. Thank you. She invited him in while she arranged the flowers in a vase. I had an interesting visitor today, Victoria Parrish. His eyebrows rose. Did you indeed? What did she want? As they walked to the hotel, Lydia recounted her conversation with the widow, including the revelation about the mysterious man who had entered the bank after Lydia's departure. Curious, Foster commented. I wonder if the sheriff will be able to identify him. I hope so. I'd like to know who really killed Parrish, if only to fully clear my name in everyone's eyes. Foster's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm. Your name is clear in the eyes of the law, Lydia. The rest will follow in time. The hotel dining room fell momentarily silent when they entered together. Then the normal hum of conversation resumed, albeit with a distinct undertone of whispers. Lydia held her head high, drawing strength from Foster's steady presence beside her. The maitre d' showed them to a table by the window, where they could see the sun setting behind the mountains. A bottle of wine appeared, courtesy of the hotel owner, along with a murmured congratulation on Lydia's acquittal. You see, Foster said as they settled in, things are already changing. Dinner was surprisingly pleasant, the food was excellent, the wine complemented it perfectly, and Foster proved to be an attentive companion. He asked thoughtful questions about her business, shared amusing anecdotes about life on his ranch, and gradually drew her out of the shell she had built around herself during her ordeal. Have you always made hats? He asked as they lingered over dessert. My mother taught me. She was a milliner too, though on a much grander scale. Her shop in Philadelphia catered to society ladies. Lydia smiled at the memory. I used to sit in the corner and watch her transform simple materials into works of art. It seemed like magic to me then. And now you work the same magic, she laughed softly. On a smaller scale, perhaps, but yes, there's something deeply satisfying about creating something beautiful with my own hands. I understand that. Building my ranch from nothing, watching the cattle thrive under my care, it's a similar satisfaction, I think. As they talked, Lydia realized how much they had in common, despite their different backgrounds and positions in life. Both valued independence and hard work. Both had faced loss and found ways to rebuild. Both saw beauty in the harsh landscape of the Colorado Territory that others might overlook. When Foster escorted her home after dinner, the evening air was cool but not unpleasant. Stars blanketed the sky, bright and clear in the absence of city lights. They walked slowly, neither seeming eager for the evening to end. At her door, Foster took her hands in his. I enjoyed tonight, Lydia. As did I. She found herself oddly breathless under his intense gaze. May I call on you again? Perhaps Sunday after church? We could ride out to the foothills for a picnic if you'd like. The idea of spending more time with him, away from the prying eyes of the town, was deeply appealing. I would like that very much. He hesitated, then bent slightly and brushed his lips against her cheek, a touch so light and brief she might have imagined it, if not for the warmth that lingered on her skin. Good night, Lydia Keller. Good night, Foster Sullivan. She watched him walk away, his tall figure gradually dissolving into the darkness. Only when he had completely disappeared from view did she touch her fingertips to her cheek, marveling at how a man she had barely known days ago had become so important to her so quickly. Over the next few days, Lydia's life began to resume its normal rhythm. More customers returned to her shop, some apologetic for their earlier suspicions, others pretending nothing had happened at all. She accepted both approaches with grace, determined to move forward rather than dwell on the injustice she had suffered. Sheriff Tanner stopped by on Friday to inform her that the investigation into Parrish's murder was continuing. Mrs. Parrish's description of the man she saw enter the bank matches several people in town, he explained. We're following up on all possibilities, including the possibility that someone else Parrish stole from might have confronted him, Lydia asked. That's our leading theory at the moment. The bank examiner has found evidence of systematic embezzlement going back at least 2 years. Parrish stole from nearly everyone who entrusted him with their money. How much did he take from me? She asked, steeling herself for the answer. The sheriff looked uncomfortable. Nearly all of it, Miss Keller. I'm sorry. She had expected as much, but the confirmation still felt like a physical blow. 3 years of careful saving, of denying herself small comforts to build a financial cushion, all gone. She would have to start over again, building her business penny by penny. Thank you for telling me, she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. Will any of the money be recovered? Some, perhaps. The examiner is still working on it. I'll let you know when we have more information. After the sheriff left, Lydia closed the shop early. She needed time alone to absorb this latest setback. In the quiet of her apartment, she allowed herself a brief cry, not just for the lost money, but for all she had endured since Parrish's death. Then she dried her tears, made a cup of tea, and began to make plans. She would survive this, just as she had survived losing her parents, just as she had survived being falsely accused of murder. She was Lydia Keller, and she was stronger than she had ever given herself credit for. On Sunday morning, Lydia dressed carefully for church in a modest blue dress with a matching hat of her own design. It was her first time attending services since her arrest, and she anticipated some awkwardness. Still, Redemption Springs was her home, and its people her community. She wouldn't hide away as if she had something to be ashamed of. Foster was waiting outside the small wooden church when she arrived. He offered his arm without hesitation, leading her up the steps and into the sanctuary as whispers followed in their wake. They sat together in a pew near the back. As the congregation rose for the first hymn, Lydia felt a tap on her shoulder. Turning, she found Mrs. Turner, the dressmaker whose shop was across the street from her own, holding out a hymnal. Share with me, the older woman whispered. Mine has the newest songs. It was a small gesture, but a significant one. By the time the service ended, several other women had approached Lydia with tentative smiles and inquiries about new hat orders. Afterward, Foster helped her into his buggy for their planned picnic. The bay mare pulled them at a steady pace out of town and toward the foothills that rolled gently at the base of the more dramatic mountains beyond. How are you really doing? Foster asked when they were well away from town. The sheriff mentioned he spoke with you about your savings. She appreciated that he asked directly rather than tiptoeing around the subject. I'm angry, of course, and worried about the future, but I'll manage. I have no doubt of that. His voice was warm with admiration. You're a remarkably resilient woman, Lydia Keller. The spot Foster had chosen for their picnic was perfect, a grassy clearing beside a small stream, shaded by cottonwood trees whose leaves whispered in the gentle breeze. He spread a blanket on the ground and unpacked the basket. Mrs. Hernandez, his housekeeper, had prepared fried chicken, biscuits, apple pie, and a bottle of lemonade. They ate leisurely, talking and laughing as they watched clouds drift across the blue sky. Lydia couldn't remember the last time she had felt so relaxed, so unburdened by worry. Tell me more about your mother, Foster said as they lingered over the last of the lemonade. What happened to her in Texas? Lydia listened intently as he recounted the story. His mother, Sarah Sullivan, had been accused of poisoning a prominent rancher's wife. The evidence against her had been circumstantial. She had prepared medicines for the woman's chronic illness, and traces of a toxic herb had been found in the victim's system. Despite Sarah's insistence that she had used only safe ingredients, she had been convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison. She died there in the second year, Foster said, his voice tight with old pain. Pneumonia, they said. I was 17, working as a ranch hand and sending what money I could for her care. By the time I got word of her illness, it was too late. How awful, Lydia said softly. I'm so sorry, Foster. The worst part came 3 years later. The real poisoner confessed on her deathbed, the rancher's daughter. She had been having an affair with her brother-in-law and wanted her sister out of the way. My mother was just a convenient scapegoat. And there was no justice? Not the kind I wanted. His jaw tightened. The family offered money, blood money, I called it. I refused it. I took what I had saved, bought some cattle, and headed north. I wanted nothing more to do with Texas or its version of justice. Lydia reached out impulsively, covering his hand with hers. So that's why you stood up for me. You saw history repeating itself? Partly. His fingers intertwined with hers. But it was more than that, Lydia. I told you I'd been watching you since you came to town. That wasn't entirely accurate. Oh? She felt a flutter of anticipation. I've been wanting to know you better for nearly 2 years, since that 4th of July celebration when you wore that yellow dress and laughed at something Mayor Billings said. Your whole face lit up, and I thought it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Her heart quickened. Why didn't you say something before? He smiled ruefully. I'm not good with words, especially when it comes to beautiful women, and you always seemed so self-sufficient, so complete in yourself. I wasn't sure you needed or wanted anyone else in your life. I didn't think I did, she admitted. After losing my parents, I was determined to rely only on myself. It seemed safer that way. And now? She looked at their joined hands, at this strong, quiet man who had stood beside her when the rest of the town turned away. Now, I'm not so sure. Perhaps there's room in my life for someone else after all. His smile was slow and sweet, transforming his serious face. Then he leaned forward and kissed her, not the brief brush against her cheek like before, but a real kiss, tender and questioning. Lydia responded with a warmth that surprised even her. When they finally drew apart, both a little breathless, she knew something fundamental had changed between them. I'm not asking for promises, Lydia, Foster said, tucking a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. I just want a chance to see where this might lead. I'd like that too, she replied softly. Very much. They returned to town as the sun was setting, the mountains cast in shades of purple and gold. Foster drove slowly, neither of them eager for the day to end. As they approached Redemption Springs, Lydia spotted a crowd gathered in the town square. What's happening? She wondered aloud. Foster reined in the horse at the edge of the gathering. Sheriff Tanner stood on the courthouse steps addressing the townspeople. Beside him, a man in handcuffs stared sullenly at the ground. That's Walter Jenkins, Foster murmured, helping Lydia down from the buggy. He owns the feed store. They moved closer, joining the edge of the crowd in time to hear the sheriff announce, Mr. Jenkins has confessed to the murder of Zachary Parrish. According to his statement, Parrish had embezzled over $2,000 from the feed store's accounts money that was meant to pay suppliers. When Jenkins confronted him, Parrish laughed and threatened to foreclose on his business if he made trouble. A murmur ran through the crowd. In a moment of rage, Jenkins drew the gun he carried for protection and shot Parrish. He then panicked and disposed of the weapon in the alley behind Miss Keller's shop, hoping to divert suspicion. Lydia felt Foster's arm tighten around her waist. After everything, to learn that her ruined reputation had been merely collateral damage in someone else's drama, it was almost too much to process. Mr. Jenkins will be transported to Denver tomorrow to stand trial for murder, Sheriff Tanner continued. In light of these events, I believe the town of Redemption Springs owes Miss Lydia Keller a public apology for her wrongful arrest and the unjust suspicion cast upon her character. All eyes turned toward Lydia, standing at the edge of the crowd in Foster Sullivan's protective embrace. Mayor Billings stepped forward, hat in hand. Miss Keller, on behalf of the town council and all of Redemption Springs, I offer our sincere apologies for the injustice you suffered. We hope you can find it in your heart to forgive us. Lydia felt Foster's silent support as she faced the crowd. These were her neighbors, people she had served and lived alongside for 3 years. Many had been quick to believe the worst of her, true, but they were also capable of acknowledging their error. "Thank you, Mayor," she said, her voice clear in the evening air. "I accept your apology. All I've ever wanted is to be a part of this community and to build a good life here. I hope we can now move forward together." A smattering of applause broke out, soon growing louder. As the crowd began to disperse, several people approached Lydia directly, offering personal apologies or expressions of support. She accepted each graciously, though she was grateful for Foster's steady presence at her side. When they finally escaped the impromptu gathering, Foster walked her to her door. Night had fully fallen, and lanterns glowed in windows along the street. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. "That was a lot to take in." "I'm not sure," she answered honestly. "I'm relieved that the real murderer has been caught, of course, and I appreciate the public apology. But knowing that I was suspected simply because it was convenient," she shook her head. "People fear what they don't understand. And a woman like you, independent, successful on her own terms, is something many still don't understand." His eyes held hers in the lamplight. "It's one of the things I admire most about you. Even though it caused all this trouble, especially because of that, you faced their judgment with dignity, Lydia. You didn't break." She leaned into him then, seeking the comfort of his embrace. His arms enfolded her, strong and steady, offering the safe harbor she hadn't realized she was looking for. "Will you have dinner with me tomorrow?" she asked impulsively. "Here, I mean. I'd like to cook for you." His smile was tender. "I'd be honored." Over the next few weeks, Lydia's life transformed in ways she could never have anticipated. Her business flourished as women who had avoided her shop during the scandal returned, often ordering more elaborate hats than they had previously purchased, as if expensive millinery could somehow make amends for their earlier suspicions. More significantly, her relationship with Foster Sullivan deepened with each passing day. They dined together regularly, sometimes at her apartment, sometimes at the hotel restaurant. On Sundays after church, they rode out to his ranch, where Lydia fell in love with the sweeping vistas, the sturdy house he had built, and the obvious pride he took in his land and cattle. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch of his ranch house watching the sunset paint the mountains in fiery hues, Foster took her hand. "Lydia, there's something I need to tell you." She turned to him, noting the serious expression on his face. "What is it?" "I've been meeting with the bank examiner and the territorial authorities. They've been able to recover some of the money Parrish embezzled, not all of it, but a significant portion." Hope flared in her chest. "That's wonderful news." "There's more." He shifted to face her directly. "I've decided to establish a new bank in Redemption Springs. The town needs a reliable financial institution, especially now that Parrish's bank has collapsed. I have the capital to do it right, with proper oversight and accountability." "Foster, that's a tremendous undertaking," she said, surprised. "Are you sure?" "I am, and I'd like you to be part of it." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "Not as an investor or a customer, though you're welcome in those capacities too, but as my wife." Lydia's breath caught as he opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant ring, a single diamond nestled between 2 small sapphires. "I know it's only been a few months," he continued when she didn't immediately respond, "and if you need more time, I understand. But I love you, Lydia Keller. I think I have since that 4th of July 2 years ago. I want to build a life with you, a partnership of equals, based on mutual respect and trust." Tears filled her eyes, not of sadness, but overwhelming joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Foster, I'll marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. They were married in October, when the aspen trees had turned to gold and the air held the first crisp hint of winter. The ceremony took place in the church where, months earlier, Foster had publicly aligned himself with Lydia against the town's judgment. Now that same community gathered to celebrate their union. Victoria Parrish sent a gift from Denver, where she had established a new life, a fine set of silver candlesticks with a note expressing her wishes for their happiness. Walter Jenkins had been convicted of manslaughter rather than murder, the court acknowledging the provocation he had suffered at Parrish's hands. The Territorial Bank had recovered almost 40% of the embezzled funds, including a portion of Lydia's savings. Most importantly, the Sullivan Bank opened its doors in December, with Foster as president and a board of respected local businessmen providing oversight. Lydia maintained her millinery shop, unwilling to abandon the independence she had worked so hard to achieve. But she also took an active interest in the bank, particularly in encouraging other women to manage their own finances, a revolutionary concept in 1875. Their first child, a daughter they named Sarah after Foster's mother, arrived the following spring. She grew up strong and confident, equally at home in her mother's shop, creating beautiful things, and on her father's ranch, learning the business of cattle and banking. Years later, when Redemption Springs had grown from a frontier town into a prosperous small city, people still sometimes told the story of Lydia Keller Sullivan, how she had walked with shame across the square while the cowboy walked beside her proud. It had become something of a local legend, a testament to the power of love and integrity against the tide of public opinion. Lydia herself rarely thought about those dark days. Her life with Foster was too full, too rich with daily joys and challenges to dwell on past injustices. But occasionally, when she saw someone in town facing unfair judgment or struggling against impossible odds, she would remember how it felt to stand alone against the world, and then how it felt when Foster Sullivan stepped to her side. On those occasions, she would reach for her husband's hand, grateful beyond words for the man who had seen her worth when others saw only suspicion, who had valued her strength when others mistook it for defiance. The man who had taught her that independence and love could coexist beautifully, like the mountains and sky that framed their home and their life together. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep and they sat together on their porch, watching the stars emerge over the mountains, Foster would take her hand and say, "Do you remember that day in the square?" "I remember," she would reply softly. "I was so afraid. And then suddenly, you were there." "I'll always be there," he would promise, and in the decades of their marriage, it was a promise he never broke. They grew old together in the house he had built, watching their children and grandchildren flourish, witnessing the frontier transform around them while their love remained constant, a testament to the truth that sometimes the most powerful act of rebellion is simply to stand beside someone when the rest of the world turns away. In the end, that was their legacy to Redemption Springs, not the bank that bore their name or the millinery shop that became renowned throughout the territory, but the example they set of courage, integrity, and unwavering love. Long after both had passed, people still told their story of the woman who walked with shame across the square and the cowboy who walked beside her proud,